Women were required to wear proper mourning clothes, to have a very lavish funeral, and to refrain from social interactions. It was customary to place an ornate monument on the grave and then stay home in the dark for a certain amount of time. But the rules were complicated. There were household manuals and popular journals that told people what they were supposed to wear depending on who died. The typical Victorian mourning clothes were elegant. The clothing started black and transitioned into gray. The clothes would eventually turn white when the grieving period was done. Men had it particularly easy because they only had to wear dark suits. A widow was expected to go into total isolation and wear full mourning clothes for 2 years. If a child lost a parent, or if a parent lost a child, the mourning time was only half. Siblings only had to mourn one another for 6 months. If you lost an aunt or an uncle, it was only 2 months. And if your cousin perished in an unfortunate accident, you only had to mourn them for about 4 weeks. Because rumors spread that it was bad luck to wear the same mourning clothes twice, people had to buy a new set every time they lost someone close to them. This was huge money for the suppliers. There was a big problem in Victorian Britain with people dying full of sin. It was common for a man or a woman on their deathbed to unburden themselves to a priest. The priest would then absolve that person of their wrongdoings and they could fade away into the afterlife knowing they would go to heaven. But the priests weren't always a sure thing, and sometimes the person died without being able to confess. When his soul was on the line, the sin eater came to amend the situation. The sin eater's sole responsibility was to eat a ritual meal at the funeral of a recently deceased person. When the sin eater had consumed the meal, they were seen as having consumed the sins of the person who had passed on. That person was then able to continue their journey after death without the stain of sin on their soul. Sin eaters, although extremely important to communities, quickly became outcasts. In the 1800s, sin eaters were popular in Scotland, Ireland, and especially Wales. The Welsh had a real obsession with sin and getting rid of it. The Aztec goddess Tlazolteotl may have been the first sin eater in the Americas. Jesus of Nazareth was also considered a sin eater for absorbing the sins of all humanity. In the 1800s, the English were obsessed with leeches. Leech use continued on and off until it exploded at the end of the 1700s. This was thanks to French physician Francois-Joseph Victor Broussais. He made the outrageous claim that all diseases were the product of inflammation. Leeches were collected by the tens of thousands in American swamps and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean. Leech collectors would allow the monsters to suck their blood for about 20 minutes because then they were easier to detach. Of course, because they're full. Many people who did this suffered serious illnesses and died. The leech craze only came to an end because it was too difficult to keep farming leeches. Leeches were so effectively pillaged from their natural environment, people thought they had gone extinct until leeches were rediscovered in the 1970s. For thousands of years, the human body has been used to create outrageous medicines. You can understand then why Victorian people were so obsessed with using crushed-up bits of Egyptian mummies as health potions. Mummia started as a mineral pitch in Arabia. It was likely bitumen taken from the Dead Sea and had nothing to do with mummies. Apothecaries sold it as a very expensive cure-all for healing just about any ailment. Persians even used it as an aphrodisiac. The supply of natural bitumen ran short. People in Western Europe started to think the word mummia came from the word mummy. In a very short span of time, natural bitumen transformed into powdered human mummy dust. Grave robbers started scraping black resin from embalmed Egyptian mummies and selling it in apothecaries. Physicians got together and agreed mummia was a translation mistake at the beginning of the 17th century. But mummia continued to be used well into the 19th century. For a brief time, artists were also grinding mummy resin to use in popular oil paint. In the Victorian era, there was a lot of death happening and people were obsessed. During the first half of the 19th century, life expectancy was around 40. There was an extremely high mortality rate for infants. Everywhere you looked, somebody was dead or dying. When somebody close to them died, they used their corpse in a photo shoot. The proper name is post-mortem photography. It's more casually known as death photography. In the first half of the 19th century, photography was a new and exciting invention. Many people who took photos of the dead had likely never taken a picture of anything else. Those who could afford it in Victorian England tried to capture the biggest moments of their lives on film. But cameras weren't exactly portable. If somebody wanted to get a photo shoot done, they generally went to a professional. In Middle Eastern societies, it was common to collect the tears of a grief-stricken person inside a special bottle known as a lacrimatory. They would then be put inside the burial tombs as a sign of respect to the dead. Tear bottles were popular during Roman times too. In ancient Rome, it was said women could even make a living from going to a funeral and crying into cups as they walked along the procession route. Legend has it the women who cried the loudest and produced the most tears made the most money. Tear collection is even mentioned briefly in the Old Testament. In Psalm 56:8, David talks about putting his tears in a bottle as a way to preserve his suffering. During the Victorian period of the 19th century, tear bottles made a big comeback. These were normally beautiful bottles made of silver and pewter, but rather than placing the tear bottles inside of a coffin or a grave, the mourning family members held on to their own vials. They watched the tears until they evaporated completely from the bottle. Only then were they allowed to stop mourning. Something similar was catching on in America. During the Civil War, women were said to have cried into bottles and then saved their tears until their spouses came home from the war. The women would then present the tear vials to their returned husbands as a symbol of their love. During the Victorian era, domestic poison spread through just about every home in London. Arsenic rapidly became one of the most widely used ingredients in dye. In 1814, it was used in emerald and brilliant green, two of the most popular colors for domestic painting. Mr. Henry Carr collected evidence of those who met their death at the hands of the poison. One of his most tragic cases was of a child in Peckham who died after sucking on a piece of wallpaper. Another person who wore stockings painted with arsenic had what looked like chemical burns on her legs. Those who wore green gloves had their hands swell to balloons. People continued to purchase green wallpaper infused with arsenic because it was the fashion style of the time. Arsenic did eventually go away. The workers who made the goods started to get really sick. People's skin was falling off and they were getting horribly ill. Many suffered ulcerations and many more died. Young girls working with artificial flowers were another of the casualties of the business. Most often, the funeral for a recently departed loved one was held in the home of the deceased. There were people who would wander around at random funerals because it was an exciting affair. At these home funerals, the body would be displayed in the front parlor. Sometimes they would be placed in their own bedroom. People would be allowed to sit with the deceased. It could be an all-night extravaganza. The body would typically be wrapped in a blanket or a quilt and then buried in the ground. The ancient Egyptians used death masks in ritual ceremonies following the death of somebody important. In Rome, elite men had their faces immortalized in plaster casts. After the death of an emperor or a member of the nobility, a plaster mold of their head would be put on display outside the family's atrium. The public could stroll along and take a look at the molding of the dead guy's head. This continued from the 2nd century BC until around 500 AD. Then, in the Middle Ages, important people started having their faces cast in plaster and bronze. After they died, their masks were kept safe in libraries and museums. People only stopped collecting death masks in the 1800s when post-mortem photography became available. One of the strangest fashion fads you don't see much more of these days is hair jewelry. Starting in the Middle Ages, hair became something you could remember a dead person by. People started to cut locks of hair from their dead loved ones and then fashion them into pieces of jewelry. A thick braid of hair would be neatly patterned inside a brooch or a pendant, then worn by the mourner. The explosion of popularity in the Victorian period was thanks to Queen Victoria herself. Queen Victoria offered a bracelet made from her own hair to Napoleon III's wife, Empress Eugenie, as a gift. And soon Europe was overflowing with hair jewelry. There were markets where you could trade long curls of hair for ribbons and trinkets. Hair started to be used in all forms of artwork and crafts. Watch chains, bracelets, cufflinks, earrings, everything you can think of. Young women would send strands of their hair in Valentine's cards as sentimental presents. Hair albums became heirlooms passed down through generations. Even with the rise of death photography, hair jewelry had a special place in Victorian life.